So continuing with our paper, 21, during a certain period, a country with constant population expands its output per head, which clearly means your output has to be increasing because your population is the same. It also experiences a significant increase in river and atmospheric pollution. In the absence of any other changes, which measure would show a decrease in living standards? So GDP and GNP per head are just going to look at output. So that really won't matter. If I recall, GDP was just the monetary value of the output produced in the economy, and then you divide that you get per head by divided by population. I believe GNP was if you take into account the net income from abroad, from assets earned abroad, and foreigners earning money from assets inside the country. And then obviously you used to have national net national product, I believe, which used to take into account depreciation. But they don't take into account pollution. They're only going to take into account the increase in output, so they're going to show an increase in living standards. Now you're left with HDI and mu, the measure of economic welfare. Sorry. So okay, so HDI. Okay, so it'll be this because HDI looks at three major things. So it looks at, I believe it was GNP per head or GDP per head. I don't know. One of the two. Doesn't really matter for our case. It looks at literacy rate, excuse any spelling errors, and like years of schooling. So like average years of schooling, it looks at that, and it looks at life expectancy. So it clearly doesn't look at river and atmospheric pollution, right? So since it doesn't look at that, you can cross it out. Measure of economic welfare does look at such things, so that's why it's going to be your answer. Because even though output shows an increase in living standards, river and atmospheric pollution can override that increase in output by showing a decrease in living standards. 22. The graph below shows percentage. So percentage changes in money GDP and consumer prices in a country between 2008 and 2010. So you have your money GDP here, you have your prices. Between 2009 and 2010, money GDP fell, but consumer prices continued to rise. So 2009, okay, so again, this is wrong because if you look at this is the percentage changes. So as long as your percentage change is in the positive, if you look at, for money GDP, so again, yeah, you can say that the money GDP, the rate of increase of money GDP fell. You can say that money GDP still rose, but it rose at a decreasing rate. You can't say it overall fell though, because for that, the percentage has to be in negative. Here, since it's percentage in positive, so that's you can cross that out because obviously money GDP has just increased and consumer prices have increased, but so that's fine, but you have to cross out the option though. Consumer prices and money GDP both continue to rise throughout the period, which is fine because both show percentages in the positive. So if there's a positive change, that clearly shows that there is an increase in both of these. Let's look at the other options anyways. In real terms, GDP grew throughout the period. Well, no, because if you look here, the GDP is like increasing by somewhat like 5%, let's say, and here your prices are increasing by like I don't know, 7% maybe. So obviously your prices are changing faster than your money GDP, which clearly means that inflation rate should be higher than the change in inflation rate, at least should be higher than your change in money GDP or nominal GDP. So your real GDP would fall, it wouldn't grow. When consumer prices, again, and this is the same misconception about thinking that money GDP fell. It didn't fall, its rate of increase just decreased. Why do economists suggest that there may be positive benefits from frictional unemployment? A short spell of frictional unemployment may lead workers to become discouraged. I don't see how that's a positive effect. how that's a positive benefit. Oh, well, they literally use two terms. I mean, positive and benefit, like, or okay, they're more or less the same thing. Frictional unemployment allows time for retraining in newly emerging skills. So frictional unemployment is when you're between jobs, when you're searching for a new job. I'm not too sure whether you're training for a new job. So let's keep this option on hold. It could be right. Job search during frictional unemployment may lead to a better match of workers and jobs. And yeah, that would be the more appropriate option, because frictional unemployment again is when you're searching for new jobs. Structural unemployment might allow time for retraining. So perhaps that's why B is wrong. It looks at structural a benefit of structural unemployment, not of frictional unemployment. The psychological effects of frictional unemployment are less than the economic effects. I mean, how is that a benefit though? It's just like saying, okay, it's not that bad. So like, psychological effects obviously would be negative, because self-esteem, all of that, loss of self-esteem, all of that type of stuff when you're unemployed. 24. The table shows the levels of consumption expenditure for given family incomes. Over the range of disposable income shown, as income increases, what happens to the MPC? Okay, so we've seen income is increasing here like this, and you need to look at your MPC. So if you remember, your MPC was basically the amount of the additional dollar, or the proportion of the additional dollar that you earn, that you spend. So you can really say the change in income upon the change in the change in consumption upon the change in income. Now you'll have to do a few calculations here. So let me just grab my calculator. Let's look at it for the first step. So income is changing by 1,000. Income is in fact changing by 1,000 in all. So if I just look at the changes in consumption, I get a pretty good idea. So consumption is changing for the first time. It's changing for minus 2150. In fact, let me just write down all the changes in consumption. That should help. Okay, so there you go. And so you can see that the change in consumption expenditure, the change that's in the important part, that is decreasing. So the change in consumption is decreasing. But look, if you look here, the change in income shown is always 1,000. So your change in income is the same, which means that your overall fraction, which is equals to your MPC, should be decreasing continuously. So that's B. 25, which could cause the official statistics for the national income per head of a developing country to overstate the true level of economic well-being of its inhabitants. So basically, the actual level of the economic well-being is less than what the national income per head says. National income per head says that it's a higher level. It says it's this particular level, but the actual level is less than the level that national income per head says. That's why it's overstating it. Okay, so if there is dependence on barter in internal trade, if there is dependence on barter, then this stuff won't be recorded. But if it won't be recorded, that leads to understating, because that means that your GDP didn't record some important economic transactions. So it means GDP is less than it actually should be, which means national income per head is less than it actually should be. So here it would understate, it wouldn't overstate. That the same goes with subsistence agriculture, because again, if it's not recorded, it understates. If services are an important component of exports, well, no, because services, even if they're an important components of exports, there is still an attempt made by national income per head to measure the importance of services, the monetary with regards to monetary values. So that shouldn't have any issue. And at times, the issue with services is that a lot of the time it's very easy for them to not be recorded. But even if that happens, if things are not recorded, as we saw in all three of these options, that leads to understating, not overstating. So it obviously would be D, because if there is extreme income inequality, your national income per head does not look at income inequality at all. So it'll be like, okay, this is the level, everything's fine, but the true level of economic well-being might be less because there's such severe inequality. shows UN population statistics for 2010 and estimates for 2050, which relationship can be confirmed from the table. And the table is basically showing your total. So they're showing two. They're showing sets of two rather, 2010 and the comparison in 2050. Um, the least developed regions have the largest populations, actual or predicted, so they don't care whichever one, in both years. So let's look at the least developed regions have the largest urban populations. Well, probably not. Like intuitively, it doesn't make sense. Usually, your least developed regions have a lot of your population living in rural areas. So, and even if you look at this, you just have to look at, you don't have to look at percentage or anything, because they ask for largest. So you can simply look at total population, these two, and you can clearly tell that it's significantly less than these numbers. So they don't have the largest urban populations. In fact, they have the smallest. The more developed regions have the lowest growth rate of urbanization between 2010 and 2050. So this, since we've talked about growth rate, you kind of have to find out change. So if you want to find out change here, this is 11%. This was also 11%. And here this is 30, 20. So this is 26% if I did the math correctly. But the point here is, the more developed regions have the lowest growth rate of urbanization between 2010 and 2050. Uh, hmm, Growth rate of urbanization. Um, I'm not sure if the relationship confirms that, because now if they're simply, I believe they're simply talking about the lowest growth rate with regards to the population. So maybe if we try to, because for the more developed regions and for the less developed regions, the percentage change is coming out to be the same. If you want to take an alternative approach and simply do this via your own calculations, well, that gives you a little difference. So like if you sorry, in fact, perhaps what I said wasn't really appropriate to the option, because they're talking about the growth rate. They don't care about, how much of the population was urbanized. Like, no one cares about that, but they care whether the amount of people living in urban populations have increased or decreased, and if so, by how much. So you try to figure out the percentage changes in this stuff. So let me go ahead and do so. That would be 1100 minus 930 divided by 930 into 100, giving you this of approximately 18. If you look at the rest, so that's 5186 minus 2556 divided by 2556 into 100. So this is like 100% change. So like this is definitely more, and I believe, and I don't want to put this in my calculator, but I can just see this is obviously going to be like some 300% change or something. So clearly, I think we can conclude that the more developed regions have the lowest growth rate of urbanization, because if you look at the urban population, the percentage change isn't as much as the other two regions. Let's look at the other options anyways. The type of region with the greatest total population in 2010 is predicted to have the greatest rate of population growth by 2050. So, well, you don't really know the rate of population growth by 2050. You can figure out the population growth between 2010 and 2050, the population change, but you can't figure out the population growth in 2050. So just on those bases, you can just cross this out. The type of region with the greatest urban population in 2010 is predicted to have the highest level of urbanization by 2050. So the greatest urban population in 2010, so that is your less developed regions. This row, and does this have the highest level of urbanization by 2050? It clearly doesn't, because it has 66% of its population urbanized. However, the more developed regions clearly have more. They have 86% of their population urbanized. So that wouldn't be it. 27. In 2015, the World Bank agreed to give a loan of 650 million to Angola to help stabilize the economy the bank said Angola needed to have a fiscal policy that would encourage the diversification of its economy. Which policy would be consistent with this requirement? Lowering interest rates to encourage investment in solar power. Well, maybe because I mean, solar power is perhaps a different way to produce electricity, and lower. Oh, sorry. But lowering interest rates. So lowering interest rates is not a fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is only going to be looking at your tax or your government expenditure, or if they mention the budget, because again the budget still mentions tax and government expenditure. So low. This in fact this wouldn't even be a monetary policy. In fact, no, I'm sorry, I stand corrected. Interest rates. So obviously, the A would be a monetary policy. Uh, don't know what's happening to me. Anyways, B, the relaxing of regulations to allow the development of a new hydropower project. That's a supply side policy. That's in fact a market-based supply side policy, if you want to be specific. Spending of the loan supporting its oil industry after the oil prices collapsed. So spending of the loan that would count in government expenditure supporting its oil industry after oil prices collapsed. I'm not too sure if this is encouraging diversification, because they're just helping the same industry, helping in oil industry. So I don't know. Let's keep this on hold for a second. The subsidizing of a partnership with a French company to establish a chain of tourist hotels. Now, subsidies can be seen as supply side policies. They can also be seen as demand management fiscal policies, because this again talks about government expenditure on subsidies. And this does seem to be some sort of diversification as well, because well, you're partnering with a French company and you're establishing uh, tourist hotels, right? If you compare this with C, you're just supporting your already existing oil industry. How are you diversifying? How are you producing something different, something new? You're just supporting what's already there. So that's why you can cross out C. A and B just aren't supply side. They just aren't fiscal policies, so they aren't even in consideration. 28. A country with demand pull inflation, which comes about by increase in AD, decides to fix its exchange rates against other currencies above the purchasing power parities. Okay, so you just fixed your exchange rates. What is likely to happen to the macroeconomic indicators shown? Now, what's so the crux of this question is to understand what it means by decided to fix its exchange rates above the purchasing power parities. So if you do so above the current purchasing power parities, but again, purchasing power parity is just another way to help you help compare exchange rates when and obviously your purchasing power parity exchange rates takes into account cost of living and so on. So it's a very nice comparison of your exchange. It's a very holistic comparison. If you fix your exchange rates above that, you could say perhaps think of this maybe as an exchange rate increase. Think of it like that, because you're fixing it above the PPP. So if you have an exchange rate increase, what happens is, now macroeconomic indicators, looking at that is a little interesting. So what would happen to interest rates? Now normally hot money, if you increase exchange rates, hot money flows in. And what should that do? If hot money, well, if hot money is flowing in, you can say it would improve your current account, because well, uh, what does happen is then you have an inflow. But at the same time, in fact, while this could be, well, hot money inflow would probably be recorded in some other account, either the capital or either the financial. So my apologies for that. In fact, if you increase your exchange rate, normally what this does is your export prices increase, which makes exports less competitive, and import prices decrease, which makes imports more readily affordable. Um, so your import expenditure increases, which means X minus M, net exports, balance of trade, whatever you like to call it, decreases, which means this worsens your current account balance. Again, this is under the assumption that the Marshall-Lerner condition, well, not the Marshall-Lerner condition, but this is under the assumption that your exports and your imports are relatively elastic. If they were inelastic, then in fact this might in fact help the current account. But usually, realistically speaking, in this day and age, selling in the international market, your exports are likely to be to some degree elastic. So this, what I've written here, should happen, and hence your current account balance should worsen. If you remember, aggregate demand was C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So if X minus M goes down, AD should go down, which means there should be a decrease in inflation. Right? And just intuitively, if you had no clue at all, you could still what should you say? You could still cross out D at the very least. Not in fact, not D. If you had no clue, you should still know that if the whichever way the current account balance, especially your balance of trade, in particular your balance of trade goes, the aggregate demand should follow the same way, because your balance of trade is a function of is basically a function for aggregate demand. So if your current account balance is improving, your inflation rate can't be decreasing. If your current account balance is worsening, your inflation rate can't be increasing. It can't be an inverse relationship. So it should, you can narrow it down to C or D, but since we already figured out the current account balance should be worsening, you can go ahead and pick C. So which means your interest rate should increase. Now so we've already picked our answer, which is C. However, let's try to still figure out why what should happen to your interest rates if you go ahead with this. If you think of this as like an increase in the in the exchange rates, well, maybe if you link this with to hot money and how hot money will flow in, if hot money is flowing in, in fact, to be honest, I'm not very sure about the effect on interest rates. Perhaps I can explain this better at the end of the video when I look at the answers and confirm so on. But that's it for now. We can still conclude that the answer is C, though. Okay, so let's go to 29. In the short run, which policy measure? So in the short run, which policy measure would tend to reduce a country's balance of payments deficit, but increase its inflation rate? Would reduce the country's balance of payment. In fact, I'm sorry. I think of random things when I'm doing other things. If you think of this, if you want an increase in exchange rate, does that mean your money supply locally is going to be less needed? Because if you want to reduce the supply of your currency internationally, obviously local money supply should decrease, and money supply and interest rates follow an inverse relationship. So interest rates should also increase then, giving you also fitting the pattern for C. So perhaps that is an explanation. Increased exchange rates means that you don't have to supply that much currency abroad, because an increased supply internationally puts a downward pressure to your exchange rate. You don't want that. So you would in fact keep money supply low. So if locally your currency is less available, internationally its supply would also go down, and low money supply means high interest rates. We can see this by the liquidity preference curve. If you reduce money supply, if money supply shifts to the left, you can clearly see that interest rates increase. Interest rates, quantity of money. It's a bit hastily drawn, the curve, but I think you get the idea. So that could be an explanation. Anyhow, let's try to focus on the question we're actually doing at the moment. 29. In the short run, which policy measure would tend to reduce a country's balance of payment deficit but increase its inflation rate? So it has to be inflationary, and it will reduce the deficit. Okay. A decrease in the level of import tariffs. If you have less import tariffs, I mean, if import tariffs go down, like so import prices go down, because tariff is like an indirect tax on imports, and so it's people will buy more imports. This would not reduce the deficit. This would just increase the deficit. So that doesn't work. An appreciation of the country's currency. Now that's interesting because they have said short run. Let's come to this in a bit. I want to discuss this at the end. Let's go to C first. An increase in the level of indirect taxes. Um, I don't see how this should have an effect on the balance of payments. Uh, I mean, if you have more indirect taxes, again, I don't see a direct link with the balance of payments because I mean, balance of payment, you think about exports, imports, transfers and all don't really get affected that much either. Uh, so it's not really affecting anything. In fact, um, investment maybe, but again, not invested consumption, it might be affecting. So anyhow, but if you increase indirect taxes, you might be reducing consumption. You might be discouraging it. In fact, this would decrease AD, and the inflation rate, demand pull inflation would decrease. So that's not what you want. So you can cross out C. A reduction in government spending. Again, I don't see a direct link with balance of payments, but with your inflation rate, a reduction in government spending clearly it decreases AD, and so your inflation rate, your demand pull inflation at least will go down. So you can cross a reduction in government spending out as well, which leaves you with B. Now, and that's why I wanted to leave B to the end, just to see before I go on into the whole in-depth explanation. Now, this is a little tricky because the idea here is in the short run, that was the key word here. In the short run, exports and imports tend to be inelastic. Now, if you can make this link, then the rest of it is rather simple, because appreciation, if you draw this here, if exchange rates go up, this means your export prices increase and your import prices decrease. However, if export prices increase, but they're relatively inelastic, that means quantity demanded for exports will fall, but it'll fall by less, but not by a lot, proportional to the exchange in price, which means total revenue, or in this case, can I say export revenue, denoted by X, should increase. Okay, and with import prices fell, but quantity demanded for imports will obviously rise following the inverse relationship between price and quantity. However, not by a lot because it's inelastic, which means import expenditure, total revenue, as we used to study in AS, but like for a producer, if you remember, inelastic. Imagine total revenue, inelastic demand, price increase for a producer. Think of it like that. Anyhow, so price has fallen by a large amount. Quantity has not reacted that much, which means your overall import expenditure, which is the same thing as saying the revenue that other countries are earning, whatever, the same thing. But the idea is here that import expenditure will fall. So since balance of trade is export minus imports, which is a very important aspect of both your aggregate demand and your balance of payments, this means export increase, import decrease, overall bracket increased. So AD should be more, so more inflation, balance of payment should also move towards a surplus, so which means there should be less deficit, and that's why you can go with B. In an economy with unemployed resources, the government increases its expenditure. When would this be least likely? Whoops. To increase national income by the full multiplier effect. Now, normally the multiplier gets smaller as you move towards full employment. So somewhere here, the multiplier will be smaller than somewhere here. Like it'll be smaller at A than at B. But here they already stated that it has unemployed resources. So perhaps that wouldn't be an option because you already know you're operating inside your PPC because it has unemployed resources. You're not on your PPC. Anyhow, let's see. When the level of autonomous private investment is increased, now understand um, the multiplier also, it would also multiply any basically any autonomous injection. So that is basically investment, that is government expenditure, and that is export revenue. So if you're going to increase private autonomous investment as well, then even the national income would definitely increase by a pretty big multiplied effect. So you can leave that out. when marginal propensity to save is reduced. Um, Again, the multiplier works best when there aren't that many leakages, because the idea of the multiplier is you inject inside the economy and that just keeps multiplying in the circular flow of income. When things leak, that kind of hinders the multiplier, because if you think about this, in fact, wait a second. Mm, multiplier k, the multiplier k can be 1 upon mpw, your marginal propensity to withdraw. In fact, let me just so let me just correct myself a bit. So here, in fact, I think I said what I said was fine. I said that the fewer your leakages, the greater the multiplier, and that's the idea here. Leakages, withdrawals, kind of like the same thing. So the smaller your marginal propensity to withdraw, the greater the multiplier. So yeah, that's exactly what I said. So we're fine there. But anyhow, so if your marginal propensity to save is reduced, that is a withdrawal. So that again, that would increase the multiplier, which is wrong, because you want to look at the least likely condition. When the government allows money supply to expand, now if money supply expands, um, well, that's interesting. I don't think that should have an effect on the multiplier, because we're not dealing with either injections nor leakages here. So I think the multiplier should just work just fine. If anything, if money supply expands, people have more money, people would start to consume, and the money would start to roll. There will be more expenditure in the economy locally, domestically. So money would start to roll more, which is fine, which helps the multiplier, in fact, because you injected, and then that money circulates very quickly because the economy is stimulated, because there's more money, there's greater money supply. Rather, that money supply does stimulate the economy. um, Anyhow, when the level of interest rates rises, and I believe this would be your answer, because when interest rates rise, people are more likely to save, right? So they're like more likely to save a greater proportion of their income, because obviously they're getting a higher rate of return on saving. So your marginal propensity to save is likely to increase. That's like the same thing as saying your marginal propensity to withdraw, because your marginal propensity to withdraw, depending on which type, whether it's 2, 3, or 4 sector economy, it was equals to your marginal propensity to save plus your marginal propensity to tax plus your marginal propensity um, to import. So in fact, I believe it was marginal propensity to save plus MPT plus MPM plus MPC. This got a little messy, but just let me fix that real quick. Okay, so plus MPC was equals to 1, because the idea was you'll save part of your additional income, you'll tax part of it will be taxed, part of it you can import, part of it you can consume, which basically makes all of this equals to your marginal propensity to withdraw. This was all of your marginal propensity to withdraw, which is, by the way, equals to 1 minus MPC. Anyhow, you don't need to know this for this particular question. But the idea is, since these three make up your MPW, if marginal propensity to save falls, then obviously, or in this case, if it rises, then obviously marginal propensity to withdraw would rise. Now look back to your multiplier formula, 1 upon MPW. If your denominator increases, the overall multiplier would decrease. So which means the full multiplier effect isn't likely to happen. It's least likely, which is why you can conclude with answer D. You can also look at this intuitively. Obviously, if you're spending or injecting inside the economy, but that money isn't being multiplied, that money isn't rolling as much, isn't being is going away. It's leaving the circular flow of income with regards to saving, because interest rates are high and people are just saving. Obviously, you wouldn't have that much of a multiplier effect there. So let's quickly check our answers. Okay, so some bad news. We got one question wrong, which was 29. Uh, and in fact, uh, we can read the examiner report on this, because, well, this was one of the questions that more candidates struggled with. So, question 29. 29, well, what's happening? Okay. No. Where did this go? Mm, Yeah, I don't know why this is messing up. Okay. So question 29 was answered correctly by 47% of the candidates, well, which do not include us, who chose the correct key C. So the correct answer was C, if you want to check. That was how, when an increase in the level of indirect taxes would reduce the balance of payments deficit, it would reduce the deficit, but it would increase inflation rate. Now, 12% chose A, 32% chose B, so that was us. And 10% chose D. An increase in indirect taxes would be likely to cause a rise in the price of goods sold on the market, including imported goods. Now, this is something that we missed out. We forgot. If you have an overall increase in the tax rate, indirect taxes, understand that tariffs are indirect taxes. They're just indirect taxes on imports. So if you're overall increasing indirect taxes, as you saw here, well, what do we see here? Yeah, an increase in the level of indirect taxes, that would obviously mean that in tariffs go up as well, because tariffs are also part of indirect taxes. That's something that we missed out here. This would tend to reduce demand, including that for imports. So like definitely, there's one way to look at it, how tariffs go up. So obviously imports are less competitive. And another way to look at it is the way they're looking at, is that if you increase if you're increasing indirect taxes, well, so because things are generally getting more expensive, you're not likely to consume as much generally, including the consumption that goes for imports. So imports, basically import expenditure falls. If import expenditure falls, then the idea remains that that your balance of trade would move towards a surplus, your deficit would reduce overall for your current account. Anyhow, but however, this may increase the overall rate of inflation, because remember, this may lead to cost push inflation, even imported inflation in this particular case. So we made the mistake of looking at inflation only from the demand side. However, this might very well lead to increase in costs, especially because raw materials will get more expensive, especially imported raw materials, and hence cost push inflation could come about. So that was the logic. And well, the marking scheme did point out that the exam report did point out that this was a question that most candidates did not deal well with. And I suppose we are just like most candidates. So that's it from my end. And that's it for this video.